how much per unit time. And in order to know how much fluid is filtered out of the glomerulus into the kidney, we need to know how much blood flows through the glomerulus in a given period of time. So every minute there are 600 mLs of plasma that flow through the glomeruli. I fixed it just now to try and fix the numbers. You'll see that they said 120. I fixed it to 125 so.
The one slide earlier.
Yeah.
You have the one coming up.
I just now.
Oh.
You sent me that picture, and so I went and I started making changes. No.
So none of these numbers matter, like for the.
None of these numbers matter in that I'm not going to ask you for specific values. I'd be giving you values. However, they matter in that you've got to understand. If I talk about normal kidney function and I tell you that it's 18 millimeters of mercury towards absorption, you need to go, no, that's not right. Not because it's 18 instead of 16, but because it should be filtration. Okay. And actually, seriously, I spent 2 hours last night trying to reconcile some of the numbers, and every source I went to had something different. And finally, I'm like, if I wasn't being recorded, I would tell you what I actually thought, but y'all know what I mean. Okay, so we already established filtration pressure is about 16, renal plasma 625. Okay, so glomerular filtration rate 125 mLs per minute at 90 gives me about 180 liters per day. I know it said 178, like I said, I just now updated. Okay, how is that different from my systemic capillaries? Because here we're talking about filtration specifically of the kidney. How is that different than what we were looking at before when we were looking at the systemic capillaries? Well, when we were looking at the systemic capillaries, the net filtration pressure was 2, not 16, resulting in a filtration rate of 3 liters a day. But we know that most of that filtrate is picked up by the lymphatic system and reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So when we look at what we call filtration fraction, what we're saying is how much is filtered out through the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule compared to how much goes into the glomerulus, right? So if I know how much goes into the glomerulus and I know how much of that leaves, I can figure out my fraction, right? An exam's worth a possible 100 points. That's the number of points available going in. How much came out? Let's be optimistic and say 92% of what went in came out. So my fraction would be 92 out of 100. Okay. Those are exam scores. That's not what we're looking at when we're looking at this. In general, 625 mLs of plasma enter the 2 kidneys each minute. 125 mLs of that goes into Bowman's capsule. So if I want to know the filtration fraction, what are the numbers? How do I use these numbers and set them up? 125, how much came out? Think of that as your score on the exam. out of the amount we had to work with. So our filtration fraction is about 20% of the blood that goes through the renal arteries as it goes through the glomerular capsule, through the glomerular capillaries. About 20% of what goes in gets filtered into the kidneys, and about 80% keeps going out the efferent arteriole. Okay, so we've already talked about when we're looking at glomerular filtration, we're looking at bulk flow. As long as the molecules are small enough to fit through those slits. Same concept as when we were talking about gap junctions. As long as it will fit through, because we have a net force of 16 millimeters of mercury favoring filtration out of the glomerular capillaries into the renal tubules, as long as that is possible, anything that can fit through will fit through. And we call that our filtered load. And obviously, how much leaves, how many sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions, blah, 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 creatinine, waste, and so on, how much leaves is rated to my glomerular filtration rate. What's that pressure? 16. It's going to influence how much leaves and how much of it is in the plasma, right? If I've got a very low concentration of something in the plasma, I'm not going to have a whole bunch of it leave. If I've got a ton of it, I expect a ton of it to be filtered. So when I'm looking at filtered load, when I'm looking at how much of a given substance, we're going to call this substance for right now X, that's related to our rate of glomerular filtration, which everything being normal is kept very, very, very steady. And even when things start to go wrong, our body homeostatically really fights to keep that steady. Times the concentration of my substance inside the plasma. So, let's, for example, look at glucose. The filtered load of glucose. In order to figure out the filtered load of glucose, I need to know my glomerular filtration rate. And my glomerular filtration rate is 125 mLs of fluid leave the glomerulus and enter into Bowman's capsule per minute. The concentration of glucose in the plasma is 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's why when we talk about glucose, we say, what's a normal glucose level? We say 100. It means 100 milligrams per deciliter. Okay? We don't want to work in deciliters. We want to work in milliliters. So 1 deciliter is 100 milliliters. So what does that give me? 1 milligram per ml. Okay? So my glomerular filtration rate is 125 mLs per minute. I'm going to multiply it by the fact that I have 1 milligram of 1 milligram of glucose per ml. So my filtered glucose is, my filtration, 125 mLs per minute. I've said that for every 1 ml, I have 1 milligram, which means in 125 mLs, I have 125 milligrams. Okay, so that's the filtered load of glucose. How much fluid is going out? And what's the concentration of that specific substance in that fluid? Roughly 100 liters of fluid is filtered every day. But we said we don't urinate roughly 180 liters of fluid every day. In fact, we eliminate about 1.5 liters, about 1,500 mLs of fluid a day. So less than 1% of what is filtered is actually excreted, which means that 99% of the fluid that was filtered out has to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream in order to maintain blood volume, which is necessary to maintain blood pressure. Okay. Small increases in glomerular filtration rate results in a large increase in the amount of fluid filtered and excreted. Okay? If my rate increases from 125 mLs per minute even to 130 mLs per minute, that's 5 mLs per minute times 60 minutes in a day times 24 hours in a day, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, that can lead to substantial fluid loss, which is why I said just a minute ago that glomerular filtration rate is so tightly regulated by the body. Okay. Extrinsic control of glomerular filtration rate. If my BP is low BP can be fixed, even if it's just a quick fix, by increasing, we just said this, volume. If my BP is low, if my blood pressure is low, I can raise my blood pressure by increasing my volume. I can increase my volume by decreasing the amount of fluid that leaves at the glomerulus. So, in response to a low BP, one of the things that the body can homeostatically do quickly is turn down glomerular filtration rate. If I turn down glomerular filtration rate, I have a decrease in my filtration pressure, and indirectly through extrinsic controls, the end result is an increase in blood volume, increase in blood pressure. So let's do these tables that we always love, or these charts that we always love. Hemorrhage, bad extreme. Sweating, day to day, sometimes more than other, depending on if we're exercising or not. But in both of these conditions, whether we're talking about the extreme circumstance of hemorrhaging or we're talking about sweating, we are talking about a decrease in blood volume because sweat is a filtrative plasma. So, if we have hemorrhaging or sweating, we have a decrease in blood volume. If I have a decrease in blood volume, I'm going to have a decrease in blood pressure. If I have a decrease in venous pressure, well, let's look at what happens with the heart. A decrease in venous pressure means I have less blood going back to my atria, right? If I have less blood going back to my atria, then I have less blood leaving each ventricle. So I've decreased stroke volume, and even if I keep my heart rate the same, if I've decreased stroke volume, I've decreased cardiac output. If I decrease cardiac output, I decrease MAP, right? Mean arterial pressure. If I decrease MAP, remember we talked about those baroreceptors, okay, that measure the pressure in the carotid bodies that go up to our brain? Those baroreceptors go, hey, pressure's too low. Let's go up to the regulatory centers of the brain and see what's going on. Additionally, a drop in venous pressure directly can also stimulate these baroreceptors. So venous pressure, or a decrease in blood volume, hits these baroreceptors directly and through changes in my arterial pressure. Well, if I have a change in stimulus that is sent to my control center says, hey, is this within my set point value? Nope. So I increase the activity of my sympathetic nervous system. Great, what does that look like? I increase renal sympathetic nervous activity. Okay, great. What does that look like inside our kidneys? Well, inside our kidneys, that means we vasoconstrict our afferent and efferent arterioles. Remember, let's go back to we're losing blood, or we're losing blood volume. If I vasoconstrict my afferent arterioles and I vasoconstrict my efferent arterioles, I have increased the resistance. And if I've increased the resistance, I have increased the resistance. I forgot I had that. If I have increased resistance, I have increased my total peripheral resistance, because remember, my total peripheral resistance is the resistance throughout the entire body. If I increase my renal resistance, that adds to an increase in my total peripheral resistance. If I increase my total peripheral resistance, my MAP increases. If my MAP increases, that is negative feedback here. So what this does is this increases MAP, fighting this. Additionally, if I've increased renal resistance, therefore increased total peripheral resistance, an increase in renal resistance means I have a decrease in fluid going through the renal glomerulus, causing a decrease in glomerular filtration. I have a decrease in glomerular filtration, so I have less blood or less serum leaving the glomerulus. Then, oh sorry, I forgot. Decreased in MAP also decreases glomerular filtration rate. Sorry. If my pressure is low, my glomerular filtration rate is going to decrease, because that glomerular filtration rate is dependent on that 16 millimeters of mercury of pressure. If I decrease that pressure, I'm going to decrease my glomerular filtration rate. So whether it's through this pathway or this pathway, and the reality is it's through both pathways, when I decrease my glomerular filtration rate, I decrease my urine flow. If I decrease my urine output, I decrease my fluid loss. If I decrease my fluid loss, then I increase my blood volume. Does that make sense? Okay, so the whole point of this is if I'm losing too much fluid, how does my body detect that? What changes are made to decrease our fluid loss? Because really what we're concerned about is blood volume to maintain blood pressure. Okay, so that is the movement of fluid and substances from the glomerular capillary into Bowman's capsule. Now we're going to move into reabsorption. And remember, I said reabsorption and secretion occur simultaneously depending on where we are. We just have to look at one first, then the other. So we're going to look at reabsorption. So our filtration was out of the glomerular capillaries into Bowman's capsule, which is part of the renal tubules. Reabsorption is going to be from those renal tubules back into the bloodstream. In this case, those vessels are the peritubular capillaries, those that are around the renal tubules. All right. So as I just said, reabsorption, movement from the renal tubules back into the capillaries, reabsorption because those substances are being reabsorbed back into the blood. Most reabsorption occurs in the proximal tubules. Not all of it, but if I said to you what's the primary place of reabsorption, you would tell me PCTs, proximal convoluted tubules, okay? Most of it occurs by bulk flow. It's not regulated. We're not talking about transporters. We're talking about pressures and concentration gradients. Okay, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about fluid. Solute reabsorption, most of that also occurs in the proximal convoluted tubules. We also have some solute reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubules. Our barriers for reabsorption, basically the same idea as we looked at before. When we were looking at the glomerulus, we were looking at the renal podocytes, these cells of Bowman's capsule. Here, we're looking at the cells of the renal tubule, my double-side tape, and my endothelial cells of the capillaries, which is minimal because these are simple squamous epithelium. Let's take a moment to remember that these are not simple squamous epithelium. Did we talk about this already? Anyone remember what it is? It's really one of the only places in the body that we find this type of epithelial tissue. That's bladder. These are simple cuboidal.
For which one?
The epithelial cells of the renal tubules. So PCT, loop of Henle, DCT. So here are my simple cuboidal cells. So up here, I have my renal tubule, PCT, loop of Henle, DCT, whichever. Here I have my peritubular capillaries that surround them. Because remember I said if I'm going to have reabsorption, I have to have blood vessels right there. So here's my peritubular capillaries. Here are my simple squamous epithelial cells. Here are the cells that line my renal tubule, okay? If I take my tubule and I do a cross section, that wall is made up of cells. That's what these are. And I have my basement membrane. that these attach to, separating the renal tubules from the epithelium. The capillary epithelium is the peritubular space that's right in here. They aren't stuck together. Water conservation. I already mentioned this before. The loop of Henle is what establishes the conditions that are necessary to concentrate urine. If we're concentrating urine, that means the urine that leaves is very, very concentrated, meaning it has very little water in it. It's to minimize fluid loss, to conserve water, to conserve blood volume, to maintain blood pressure. Where's that done? That's done in the juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's reabsorption. Now let's look at secretion. And secretion is there anything else I want to take out of my peritubular capillaries and dump out into my renal tubules? So that's what I just said. The barriers are the same for reabsorption because they occur at the same place. Right? These are occurring in the same regions. So the barriers that have to be passed to go from the lumen of the renal tubule to the lumen of the peritubular capillaries are the same barriers if we want things to go from the lumen of the peritubular capillaries into the lumen of the renal tubules. Transport mechanisms are the same conceptually, but in the opposite direction of when we're looking at reabsorption. Some of the substances that are additionally secreted include potassium ions, hydrogen ions, choline, like acetylcholine, creatinine, drugs such as penicillin. You will often hear about drugs. Do they have hepatic clearance? What does that mean? What's hepatic? Liver. Hepatic clearance or renal clearance. Okay? We look at this all the time with two super common drugs, medications. What are they? Ash, you and I were talking about them. Ibuprofen and acetaminophen, right? One of them is got renal clearance, the other has got hepatic clearance. So, and of course now I'm going to blank on which is which. Good job, Holly.
I think the ibuprofen's harder on the liver.
Okay, so ibuprofen gets cleared out of the blood through the liver. So if you take a lot, you know that's not the quantity I would have used if I wasn't being recorded. A lot of you said ibuprofen?
Yes.
A lot of ibuprofen, you have to worry about damage to your liver. So then people are like, that's okay, instead of taking ibuprofen, I'll take acetaminophen. You bulk up on that, then you have to worry about damage to your kidneys. Well, which do I take? Neither one of them in huge quantities for any substantial period of time. It's all about moderation. It's all about balance.
That's why they tell you to stack those two.
Yep. All right, so that's secretion in a nutshell. Excretion, we're not going to focus on, but that's moving out of the tubules, including collecting ducts, out to being passed. Are we done, or do we have 5 more minutes?
5 more minutes.
We have 5 more minutes, right? Isn't it till 1:25?
Yes.
Okay, I want to get everything in here I can. Okay, so now, let's look at specialization of our renal tubules. Okay, proximal convoluted tubules, non-regulated reabsorption, bulk flow, according to each substance's moves according to each substance's concentration gradient. Water conservation specific are primarily loop of Henle. So this is bulk, right? This is just down each individual substance's concentration gradient. The loop of Henle is involved in both cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons, but primarily in juxtamedullary nephrons, water regulated. When we get to the ascending loop of Henle, and when we get to reabsorption and secretion in the distal convoluted tubules, that's regulated. What does that mean? It means we're looking at transporters. Okay. So, when you look at this, and we look at the proximal convoluted tubule, notice PCT is where we have the vast majority of our non-specific reabsorption. In fact, that's where we have the bulk of molecules that are reabsorbed. We have some protons that are secreted at this point. We go into the descending loop of Henle. We're looking at water reabsorption. The ascending loop of Henle, we have specific, so again, transporter regulated reabsorption of some of these substances. Distal convoluted tubule, transporter regulated reabsorption of these, secretion of these. Collecting duct, transporter regulated reabsorption, absorption. There's a lot going on in the kidneys, and I know it doesn't feel like way, but these are just the very, very, very basic molecules. All right, I'm gonna stop. Not because I want to stop, but you guys want to